You're listening to an IACP podcast, www.iacprx.org. Welcome back to the IACP podcast. This is Scott Maitland, your Director of Communications and Publications at IACP, and your host for the IACP podcast. Last week, I spoke with David Miller about office use, and we got some great feedback from listeners in Texas, Arizona, Oregon, and California. Thank you for your feedback. This is your show, so if you have any questions, comments, or thoughts, give us a call at the IACP podcast line. That phone number is 713-730-9043. Again, that number is 713-730-9043. Or shoot us an email at iacpinfo@iacprx.org. I've got Dave with me again this week to discuss APIs and DQSA. But before I jump into the show, just a friendly reminder that if you're in the Boston area, Dave will be giving an IACP regional education meeting tomorrow evening, Thursday, April 23rd. For more information, visit the link in the notes or visit us online at iacprx.org and click on the compounder calendar. So Dave, welcome back to the show. This week we're talking about APIs and the Drug Quality and Security Act, or DQSA. Now that DQSA is passed, I know there are still a lot of questions out there surrounding bulk ingredients, what I can use, what I can't use in compounding. Dave, are there any simple rules to follow?
Yeah, Scott, actually there are. And, you know, this question about the use of bulk ingredients or active pharmaceutical ingredients in compounding and where they fit into Section 503A of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, this is not new language. This is actually language that has been part of 503A ever since it was enacted back in 1997. So there's three basic checks that if I want to use a bulk ingredient, I have to double check. So number one is, does the drug product have a USP monograph? Okay, most of our medications, most of our APIs do. The second is, okay, there's no USP monograph, but is it part of a currently or previously FDA-approved drug product? Then the third is, if it doesn't meet either of those two criteria, then the next criteria is, has the Pharmacy Compounding Advisory Committee that is formed within the DQSA, within Section 503A, have they reviewed and made a decision on whether a bulk ingredient should be placed on what we call a positive list? By the way, those words, positive list, does not exist in the Drug Quality and Security Act. It's shorthand that we use in the compounding community. So those are the three checks that you have to do. Does it have a monograph? Yes, no. If not, is it part of an approved FDA product? Yes, no. If not, has it been reviewed and included on a list from the Pharmacy Compounding Advisory Committee and signed off on by the Secretary of Health and Human Services?
So let's talk about the drugs that have been submitted to the advisory committee. When is this list going to become available to us?
That's a good question. We don't know. First and foremost, the Pharmacy Compounding Advisory Committee wasn't appointed and didn't have its first meeting until the very beginning of 2015. Back in 2014, the FDA actually in March had a deadline of drugs that the public, IACP, other stakeholders could submit for consideration by this committee. The agency refined some of the criteria and asked for the list to be submitted again. They were. That was in September of 2014. Right now, we're aware of several thousand drugs that don't meet the criteria as APIs of either having a monograph or not being part of an FDA-approved drug. A couple of easy examples that we can think of. Dietary supplements. Those aren't FDA-approved. There's some OTC medications. OTCs aren't officially approved the way that the FDA defines approval. All of those drugs had to be gone through by academics, by hospital pharmacists, by community pharmacists, folks that are engaged in compounding in various practice settings and put together and submitted to the agency. So, as I said, there's a couple of thousand of those out there. The Compounding Advisory Committee actually tackled 6 at its first meeting, 4 of which were considered to be appropriate for compounding, APIs that we could use. 2, specifically, piracetam and silver protein mild were deemed not appropriate to be compounded. We can't use those two APIs. What we don't know now, and we have asked but haven't received a clear answer, is how long it's going to take that compounding advisory committee to get through those several hundred, several thousand individual drugs. So for us as compounders, one of the biggest challenges that we face is that we don't know when some of these APIs that fall into that it needs to be on a list are actually going to be placed on that list.
Okay, well, let's put this into a practical application. Let's say I've got a patient who is stabilized on one of those drugs that is on the non-approved list. What happens next?
Well, that's a tough call. And the simple answer is we don't know. It is actually unknown at this point. There are no exemptions that are provided to compounders for the use of any bulk ingredient that sort of falls in the cracks. So one of the classic examples that we use is methylcobalamin. It is not part of a formally FDA-approved drug. It does not have a monograph. It's actually very difficult to test in order to create a monograph. Patients use that for anemia. Unfortunately, it has to go through the review process to be formally blessed. We have patients that are stabilized on that medication right now, going to your question, but technically, a pharmacist or any other compounder who uses bulk API methylcobalamin is actually in violation of Section 503A in the Drug Quality and Security Act. One of the things that IACP is pushing for is we need to have a statement from the federal government that until those drugs are actually formally presented, that we will have an exemption in order to be able to continue to use them. Because first and foremost, we don't want to interrupt and don't want to interfere with patient care, especially in those patients that have been on a medication, have seen success, and that are achieving the therapeutic outcomes that we want to have them have.
All right, Dave, thanks for answering those questions. And listeners, thank you for coming back and joining us for another episode of the IACP podcast. Hey, listen, if you want some more information on DQSA, be sure and visit the online edition of Compounding Matters Quarterly and read Dave's cover story from our winter issue, Standing Together, Fixing the Drug Quality and Security Act. All of us at IACP hope you really enjoyed the show. And if you did, could you please take a moment and subscribe and share the show with your colleagues, your employees, anyone you think would be interested. Be sure to tune in next week for our show on recalls. This is Scott Maitland signing off until next time, and here's to the health of your pharmacy.